The city rose like a restless child beside the old homes of the ancestors. Tall glass buildings caught the sun and threw it back into the sky, shining proudly, while nearby, family compounds sat quietly with cracked walls and dusty courtyards. Old mango trees still stood where grandfathers once sat to tell stories, even as machines roared past them. In the early mornings, the smell of street food mixed with the smoke of cooking fires from the compounds. It was a place where yesterday and tomorrow lived side by side, never touching, only watching each other in silence. People said the city had its own drum. It beat day and night, cars honking, music blasting, voices shouting deals and promises. That drum was sweet to the ear, calling young men and women to dance to its rhythm. It promised money, respect, and a new name. But with every beat, the voices of ancestors grew softer. Old teachings about patience, loyalty, and honor were drowned by the sound of quick success. "The city gives with one hand and takes with the other," an old woman once whispered, but few listened. Long before the city grew this loud, a marriage had been sealed under the open sky of the village. Elders gathered, their walking sticks resting beside them. Prayers were spoken slowly, calling the names of those who came before. Bride price was paid with care, not as a purchase, but as respect. Hands were shaken, cola nuts broken, and laughter filled the air. An elder had said, "This union is not just between two hearts, but between two families and their ancestors." In those days, love felt strong and protected, like a hut built on solid ground. The wife carried those words with her into the city. She was a woman of few words, waking before dawn, working until night fell. She moved through the house softly, like someone carrying a full clay pot on her head, careful not to spill, careful not to break. Her mother's voice lived in her heart. "Endure," it said. "A calm river runs deep." She believed that silence could save a marriage, that patience was a woman's shield. Even when pain pressed on her chest, she swallowed it and kept walking. Her husband had not always been like this. Once, he was a village son who greeted elders with both hands and bent his head in respect. He remembered sleeping on mats and dreaming of a better life. The city gave him that life. Slowly, his clothes became finer, his speech sharper. He learned to laugh at things he once honored. When friends spoke of villages, he smiled but said nothing. Shame crept into him like a quiet sickness. He began to hunger for applause, for eyes that admired him. The past started to feel like a shadow he wanted to escape. With success came pride, and with pride came distance. He spent more time outside, more time looking at his reflection in glass doors and car windows. At home, his eyes passed over his wife as if she were part of the furniture. One evening, when she asked softly, "Will you eat now?" he replied without looking, "Leave it there." The space between them grew wide and cold. He began to measure worth by clothes and smiles meant for the public, forgetting the loyalty that waited for him at home. And though the city drum kept beating louder, the ancestors watched, silent and patient, knowing that every rhythm has its ending. She entered his life the way the city entered the village, without asking permission. Her laughter arrived before she did, sharp and confident, turning heads wherever she passed. She dressed like someone who believed the world was a mirror meant to admire her. In her eyes, love was not something to be hidden like a seed in the soil. Love, she believed, must shine, must be shown, must be envied. "Why should people guess your happiness?" she once said, adjusting her bright clothes as they sat in a crowded cafe. "If a thing is good, let the whole city see it." He smiled, pleased by how others watched them. With her beside him, he felt taller, louder, important. She wore the city like a crown, and through her, he tasted its praise. Slowly, his house began to carry two truths under one roof. By day, he was the city man with the admired woman on his arm, eating out, laughing loudly, living brightly. By night, he returned to a quieter home where shadows were longer and words fewer. He did not announce the change. He allowed it to grow on its own. The wife was no longer introduced. She was no longer included. She was simply there, like a wall that had always stood and was now taken for granted. In that same house, the wife began to disappear without leaving. Visitors came, and she was told, "Bring water," or "Clear the plates." No one said her name. No one asked who she was. When she stood in the room, eyes moved past her. Once, a woman asked lightly, "Is she your help?" Before she could speak, her husband answered, "Yes. She helps around the house." The words did not strike her like thunder. They sank into her slowly, like cold rain. She lowered her eyes and walked away, carrying the pain with the bowls in her hands. The man found it easier to lie each day. In the city, he reshaped his story like clay. He spoke of struggle but left out the wife who stood beside him. He spoke of hunger but forgot the land sold to feed his dreams. "I built myself," he told new friends. "No one helped me." They nodded, impressed. Each lie pulled him further from the boy who once greeted elders with respect. The present clapped for him, and he forgot the past completely. Yet the house did not fall. Meals were still cooked. Clothes were still washed. Peace was still forced to sit at the table. The wife moved like a quiet fire in the hearth, unseen, unpraised, but still warming the home. She rose before dawn, her back bent but unbroken. In silence, she held the pieces together, even as she herself was forgotten. Far away, in the village, an elder shook his head as he listened to news carried by the wind. "A man who cuts his roots," he said softly, tapping his stick on the ground, "should not cry when the tree no longer gives him shade." The warning drifted like smoke into the city, but the man did not smell it. He was too busy listening to applause, unaware that the ground beneath him was already beginning to loosen. Wealth did not arrive quietly. It came with polished shoes, shining watches, and clothes that spoke before the man opened his mouth. When he walked, people noticed. When he sat, eyes followed. Slowly, he began to believe the cloth on his body was more important than the character inside it. He spent long moments before mirrors, adjusting collars, smoothing pride into his posture. When his wife once said gently, "You look good today," he replied without warmth, "This is how respected men look." He no longer asked himself if he was good, only if he looked successful. With success came new friends, men who laughed loudly and drank deeply from the city's promise. They slapped his back and praised his rise. One evening, as they sat beneath bright lights, one of them joked, "Ah, village life! Mud houses and old women telling stories." Laughter followed. Another added, "You don't look like someone who came from there." He smiled, though something tightened in his chest. When someone asked about his wife, a friend winked and said, "Don't tell us you still live like that." The man laughed too, even louder, letting shame dress itself as humor. The door to tradition did not close all at once. It creaked shut slowly. Invitations to funerals were ignored. Calls from elders went unanswered. Sacred gatherings became too busy to attend. When his uncle visited the city and asked, "Why haven't we seen you at the last rites?" he replied, distracted, "City life is different now." The elder looked at him for a long moment and said quietly, "A river that forgets its source will dry one day." The man nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. The first lie slipped out easily. It surprised even him. At a work gathering, a woman asked kindly, "Is that your wife?" He paused, then said, "She helps around the house." The words tasted strange but sweet, sweet because no one questioned him. He watched his wife lower her eyes and walk away. That night, he told himself it was nothing. "Just words," he muttered. But words, once released, do not return the same. Soon, lies no longer came by accident. They were chosen. When guests arrived, he spoke over his wife, answering for her, naming her as the Maid. One afternoon, she whispered, "Why do you do this to me?" He frowned. "Do what?" he asked. "You embarrass me," she said softly. He snapped, "Learn your place." In that moment, her name fell from his mouth forever, replaced by a title that erased years of sacrifice. The other woman noticed the change and enjoyed it. She moved through the city like someone who owned it, her scent lingering after she passed. Attention fed her. Praise made her glow. When she stood beside him, she felt powerful. "People should see us," she said, smiling as phones turned toward them. "Let them know you belong with someone like me." She laughed when others stared, knowing each look pushed another woman further into the shadows. Her words soon became advice, sweet on the surface, bitter beneath. Late at night, under city lights, she leaned close and said, "Why do you carry village things like stones on your back? Cut them off." You deserve better." He hesitated. "My people," she interrupted, "your people are your future, not your past. No one respects a man who still smells of poverty." She touched his arm and added softly, "Appear single. Appear free." At home, the wife heard these changes in silence. She swept floors and washed clothes while the house filled with absence. Sometimes she paused, listening to the walls, wondering when love had left without saying goodbye. Yet she remembered her mother's words, "Even when fire is hidden, it still cooks the food." She held on, not knowing that patience was shaping a storm, and that the lies spoken so easily were calling justice closer with every breath. In public, his laughter became generous and loud when the other woman was near. He held her hand where people could see, buying gifts that shone like festival drums. "You deserve the best," he told her, his voice warm. At home, his voice changed. It became short, sharp, and cold. When visitors came, the wife was sent away. "Stay inside," he ordered. Curtains were drawn, doors half closed, and the house felt split like a calabash broken down the middle, one side full of light, the other swallowed by shadow. Inside her own home, the wife began to feel like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. "Bring water," he said without looking at her. "Clean this now." When she tried to speak, he raised a hand. "I did not ask for your opinion." Even when elders' wives visited, she was made to stand while others sat. Her voice shrank, her steps became careful. Each command pushed her deeper into silence, turning love into labor and marriage into duty without honor. Night came, but rest did not follow. He slept facing away from her, a wide space between their bodies. Sometimes he did not come home at all. She lay awake, listening to the ceiling, counting her breaths. No insults were spoken, yet the distance screamed louder than words. She remembered when nights once held whispers and shared dreams. Now, even the darkness felt crowded with absence. The mat grew cold, and loneliness wrapped itself around her like harmattan wind. In that quiet, her mother's voice returned, gentle but firm, like a drum heard from far away. "My daughter," the memory said, "a woman's dignity is her shield." She remembered her mother pounding yam, saying, "Patience is strength, but silence should never kill the soul." Stories of grandmothers flowed back, women who endured storms but never forgot who they were. These teachings sat with her, refusing to fade, warming her heart when the house felt empty. Yet a war began inside her. One voice said, "Endure. This is marriage." Another rose softly but firmly, "You are still human." She washed clothes with shaking hands, asking herself how long patience should last. "If I speak, will I break the home?" she wondered. "If I stay silent, will I lose myself?" Each day, the question grew heavier, pressing against her chest like an unseen stone. Outside, tongues moved quickly. Neighbors leaned over fences, whispering as pots boiled. "Have you seen how he treats her?" one asked. Another replied, "A house cannot stand on one pillar." Children noticed too. Silence became a story everyone knew. Eyes followed the wife as she walked, some filled with pity, others with judgment. The compound hummed with quiet talk, and every whisper added weight to the air. Among the women, there was no single voice. Some said, "Our mothers endured worse." "Stay." Others shook their heads. "Fire that is not stopped early will burn the whole house." Older women spoke of patience as survival. Younger ones spoke of dignity as life. The wife listened to them all, her heart torn between yesterday's wisdom and tomorrow's warning. As the moon rose that night, she understood one truth clearly. The road ahead would demand a choice, and whichever path she took would change her forever. The night was alive with lights and music, yet inside one grand hall, a quiet storm brewed. The mistress walked in first, her heels clicking like drums of triumph. Heads turned, whispers followed, and cameras captured her every move. She laughed brightly, the sound bouncing off glass walls, and the husband's chest swelled with pride. He held her hand in public, letting the city see what he wanted it to see, while the wife moved silently behind, carrying trays of drinks, folding napkins, bending without notice. Each step she took went unseen, every word unspoken. She had become part of the furniture, a shadow in the gleaming hall. A guest asked, "Is she your maid?" The husband did not hesitate. "Yes," he said loudly, "she helps around the house." His voice was sharp, clean, cruel. The word cut deeper than the glare of the city lights, striking at her heart, her dignity, and the laws her ancestors had taught. Silence fell heavy. Even the music seemed to bow. She felt the insult as a wound, spiritual and deep, echoing in every corner of the hall. An elder, leaning on his carved staff, spoke quietly to those nearby. "A tree that forgets its roots under the sun will wither before the rains come," he said. Eyes followed him as he scanned the room, voice calm but firm. His gaze fell on the husband, but pride turned the man's ears deaf. The warning carried the weight of generations, yet it floated past him like a bird that does not stop for stones. He walked on, head high, ignoring the words, ignoring the eyes that knew what they had seen. Every step toward the mistress, every smile exchanged, confirmed the path he had chosen. The ancestral counsel, the moral compass, the quiet voices of the village, all were left behind. In their place grew arrogance, bright and dangerous. At home later, the wife sat in the darkness, her hands folded over her lap. Tears came once, but not tonight. Tonight, they refused to fall. The pain she carried folded into itself, no longer spilling over. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of her endurance transform into quiet strength. No plea escaped her lips. No explanations were offered. Silence was no longer weakness, it became her shield. In that stillness, she let absence speak for her. In her quiet, a fire burned, unseen, unshaken, waiting for the moment the world would have to notice. She stopped speaking. Not because the words had no weight, but because she realized that speaking had changed nothing. Her pleas had been swallowed by pride and noise. So she began to watch. Every gesture, every whispered lie, every glance and half-truth became seeds planted quietly in her mind. She noticed the way he straightened his back when the mistress entered a room, the way he spoke over her when others asked questions, the way he laughed at jokes that belittled their past. She stored it all, knowing that storms do not break trees that grow slowly from careful soil. Her mother's voice returned to her, soft yet firm. "My daughter," it said, "dignity is stronger than noise. The river that knows its path will carve the land, but the rushing water breaks itself against the stones." She remembered the women of her lineage, who had endured famine, loss, and betrayal, yet had walked with heads held high. "Patience is not surrender," the voice whispered, "and silence has a power louder than shouting at the wrong time." She thought of the hands that had once lifted him from the dust of the village, that had sewn his shirts, polished his shoes, cooked his first meals, and cleared every path he walked. Those hands were not empty, they had built the ladder he now climbed. Yet no one acknowledged them. She realized then that the ground she stood on was firm, that her labor had anchored him without his ever knowing. The inheritance she had surrendered, the land she had given, the nights spent laboring while he slept, these were invisible threads holding the house together. She had shaped stability, carved paths for success, and laid foundations quietly, as if her work would always be invisible. Yet, every brick, every coin, every sacrifice was her invisible signature, marking the future with her patience and strength. And there it was, the power he never touched. Legal papers tucked away, lands registered, accounts opened in her name, traditions upheld in her careful hands. She held authority he never questioned, confidence he never imagined. The weight of the household, the structure of wealth and recognition, all rested in the palms of the one he called Maid. Like the pot left on the fire, she simmered quietly, unacknowledged yet essential. The food that would nourish the home, the meal that would sustain life, depended on her. He ignored it, blinded by the mistress display, unaware that the unseen still controlled the outcome. Meanwhile, the mistress moved with laughter and light, believing victory complete. She twirled in silk and perfume, her eyes bright with triumph, unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already begun to shift. Confidence blinded her. She did not notice the subtle currents of power swirling under the surface, nor did she hear the quiet drumbeat of patience and preparation that would soon demand its reckoning. The mistress spoke with a sharp edge, her words dripping with expectation. "I will not wait in the shadows any longer," she said, her voice rich with silk and command. "I deserve a ring, a place in this house that the world can see, and her, gone. She cannot stay." Her eyes, bright as polished beads, rested on the wife, who stood silent, hands folded, shoulders steady. The husband swallowed hard, trapped between the glare of his new love and the quiet power of the woman he had long underestimated. I will arrange it," he murmured, voice wavering. In the city, the walls built by wealth began to show their cracks. A shipment delayed. A business partner silent. A deal slipping through fingers once thought unbreakable. At home, tension hummed like a low drum. The mistress' laughter sometimes faltered, the husband's pride stumbled, and small disorder crept through the household like smoke under the door. Everything carefully polished was not as strong as it seemed. Outside, whispers moved faster than harmattan wind, through streets, markets, and waiting courtyards. "Have you seen how he treats his first wife?" one woman asked. "It is shameful," said another. Children repeated phrases they did not understand fully but felt in their bones. The stories spread quietly, growing roots in each ear that heard them. Elders watched, leaning on carved staffs, their faces calm yet deep with knowing. No words passed, yet their eyes spoke volumes. They had seen pride rise too fast, greed show itself, and injustice cling to houses like stubborn dust. They waited, as always, knowing that truth does not hurry, it comes fully formed, like rain after a long drought. The city and the ancestors converged at last in one courtyard, one hall. Modern lights shone on polished floors, while carved stools and ancestral masks reminded everyone that roots run deeper than concrete. The elders sat among city elites, their eyes steady and patient. The boundaries between past and present, power and humility, were suddenly visible. Judgment had a seat, and it was full. A celebration began, bright with music, laughter, and applause. Food steamed in large pots, flowers shone in vases, and city lights glittered against glass walls. No one suspected that pride itself had invited truth to the table. What was meant to display triumph now teetered on the edge of revelation. The husband walked in, chest out, shoulders square, confidence like armor over his fear. "Look at what I have built," he whispered to himself, brushing past greetings and bows. He smiled at the mistress, held her hand, and felt untouchable. Yet, in the corners of the hall, he did not notice the quiet gaze of those who knew history, those who saw deeds uncounted and truths hidden in plain sight. And then, ancestral eyes fell, quietly, on the woman the city ignored. She stood in the background, head straight, hands folded, dignity unbroken. The elders' gazes lingered, tracing the lineage of sacrifice and patience that had been dismissed for flash and noise. Something in the air shifted. The silence around her hummed with the weight of stories untold, power unseen, and a reckoning that had been waiting patiently for its moment. The room was alive with expectation, though no one had yet spoken the words that would shift its balance. Papers, long signed and sealed, lay quietly on a polished table. Elders leaned on carved staffs, their eyes sharp, watching the smallest gestures. A contract, a ledger, a recorded oath, each waited its turn, patient like the rain that follows a long dry season. The tension was a drumbeat, growing louder, though the mouths of men remained still. Everyone felt it. The first crack had appeared before any word was spoken, invisible yet undeniable. Then it happened. A scroll was unfurled. The witnesses, those who had stood silently for years, stepped forward. Murmurs rose and fell like the wind in tall grasses. The wife, who had been quiet, steady, and unseen, suddenly stood in the center of the gathering. "This," an elder said, lifting the paper, "belongs to the one who kept the hearth, who bore the weight of labor and love alike. Her place is not behind shadows. It is here, recognized by all." Eyes turned to her as her identity was spoken aloud. Wife, partner, anchor of the household. Community and God alike now saw what had been ignored. "It is she," another elder affirmed, "who gave the land, the labor, the patience, and the honor that built this home. All else is borrowed from her strength." The sacrifices buried beneath wealth and status surfaced, land deeded in her name, accounts opened with her trust, nights spent laboring for the household's growth. Every unseen act was counted at last, acknowledged by witnesses and ancestors. The house they had built on her back now recognized her as the foundation. Authority shifted quietly, like a river changing course beneath stones. No shouting was needed, no demands uttered. Legal rights, moral authority, and ancestral acknowledgement all moved toward her naturally. The crowd watched, silent but attentive, as the balance of justice found its place. The husband's carefully crafted stories began to unravel. Every boast, every lie, fell away under the weight of truth. One by one, his claims, about wealth earned alone, sacrifices made solo, and status self-attained, collapsed like a house built on sand. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. Truth spoke louder than any plea. The mistress, once dazzling in her silk and perfume, froze as reality settled around her. Her place had been borrowed, her triumph built on deception. She had not won anything of substance. Pride faded from her eyes, replaced by a sudden bitter understanding that all she stood upon had always been someone else's foundation. The husband stood in the center of the room, stripped of his titles, his respect, and the facade he had worn like armor. The elders, witnesses, and community saw him as he was, alone, ashamed, and confronted by consequences long ignored. His pride trembled, his identity shook, and the mask of superiority fell quietly to the floor. The mistress was disgraced, yet not by insults or mockery. The truth itself moved gently, unflinching, revealing the hollowness of her victory. She had been exposed by reality, by the rightful order restored, by the weight of patience and virtue finally acknowledged. Silence carried more justice than 1,000 shouts. And in that stillness, the wife stood tall, dignified, the quiet power that had always been her own now shining for all to see. The wife stood at the center of the courtyard, her posture calm, her eyes steady, a quiet storm contained within her. No harsh words escaped her lips, yet her silence carried more weight than any shout. The crowd, still murmuring from the revelations, could feel the strength in her restraint. She did not seek vengeance. She did not call down curses. She simply held herself with dignity, letting truth, patience, and moral power speak for her. An elder stepped forward, leaning on a carved staff worn smooth by generations. "Let this be known," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the whispers like a spear through mist. "Justice is not cruelty. It is correction. It restores balance where arrogance has broken it." His gaze swept the assembly, then rested on the husband and mistress, whose faces had fallen pale and taut. The city itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Tall buildings, once symbols of unchecked ambition, now appeared fragile beside the wisdom of those who had walked the land long before concrete and glass. Modern success bowed quietly before ancestral truth. Those who had mocked tradition now felt the weight of roots, understanding that a home built without them trembles under the first storm. The husband lowered his head under the open sky, the shame pressing upon him like the heavy rains of the harmattan. Every neighbor, every colleague, every elder watched, and justice unfolded not through vengeance but through the undeniable truth that his betrayals carried consequences. He felt the weight of every lie, every insult, every stolen moment of honor that had been his to protect. As the crowd dispersed, murmurs fading like wind through the tall grass, the husband remained. He was alone, surrounded by the silence of lost respect. Titles that once adorned him fell away like borrowed garments, leaving only the thin fabric of his empty pride. Friends and allies turned away, unwilling to carry the burden of his disgrace, leaving him to walk the narrow path of reflection. Meanwhile, the wife moved among the elders and neighbors, her calm presence a beacon. She had chosen strength over vengeance, dignity over destruction, and in doing so, she reminded all who had watched that patience, endurance, and moral courage are the true measures of power. The city had seen it now. Roots, once honored, outlast the noise of false success, and integrity, when unbroken, carries a quiet, unstoppable authority. The husband sat alone in the dim light of his once grand home, the echoes of applause and whispers still lingering in the walls. His chest tightened with each memory of the night that had stripped him bare, not by force, but by truth. He reached for the pride that had once made him walk taller than everyone else, but it slipped through his fingers like sand. The city had cheered his success, yet no voice could soothe the restlessness that had taken root in his heart. I have nothing left," he whispered to the shadows, realizing that punishment often lived within long before the world noticed. The mistress swept past the courtyard gates, her silk skirts brushing the stones, her laughter hollow and brittle. She had worn the city like a crown, yet the weight of humiliation followed her. "Another city, another stage," she murmured, forcing cheer where shame lingered. But the illusions she chased were empty, her victories borrowed and fading. In contrast, the wife stood at the edge of the compound, her hands folded, her breath steady. The choice before her was sharp and quiet, forgiveness or freedom. She had measured each step with care, her eyes clear, her spirit unbroken. "I will not strike back," she said softly to herself. "My peace is my own, and my dignity my shield." Her strength needed no cruelty, no dramatic vindication. The power she carried healed quietly, restoring what had been wronged without the need to humiliate. He finally looked at the path he had chosen, the wealth, the city lights, the false admiration, and saw what it had cost him. Roots severed, respect lost, home hollowed, and peace forever distant. The wife, once unseen, now stood like a pillar, her presence acknowledged by neighbors, elders, and even those who had doubted her for too long. An elder stepped forward, leaning on a gnarled staff that had guided generations. "Let this be remembered," she said, voice calm but firm. "Balance is not vengeance. It is understanding, restoration, and the protection of what is sacred. Let all who hear this know that patience carries power, and abandoning one's roots invites collapse." The city lights flickered and dimmed, but the wisdom of the ancestors held steady, unmoved. In that quiet glow, the lesson endured. Pride built on falsehoods falters, silence chosen with dignity strengthens, and the roots of one's heritage remain the surest shelter against any storm. The wife walked forward, no longer a shadow, but a woman restored, a truth finally seen, carrying the story like a cherished family heirloom into the days yet to come.